What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diverge? How do they diverge? How do they diverge? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality.
Hi there, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Diversity and Spirituality Network is an emerging community of people who are actively exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. We have a lot of different opinions as to what that looks like, but for me personally, I see looking at difference as nothing less than a sacred path in and of itself. I'd like to invite you to rate the podcast on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts, which goes a long way towards helping us spread the word. Today, I feel privileged to interview Dr. Christel Manning, who's a professor of religious studies at Sacred Heart University. Dr. Manning's research interest includes the intersection of religion, gender, and sexuality, the sociology of new or marginal religious movements, and most recently, the dramatic rise of the so-called religious nuns, or people with no religion. Her book from NYU Press, Losing Our Religion, How Affiliated Parents Are Raising Their Children, was named a top 10 most influential book of 2015, and won a 2016 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Scientific Study of Religion. She currently has a Templeton Foundation grant to study meaning-making narratives among non-religious individuals facing end of life. And that's what I'm going to talk to her about today. Dr. Manning, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You're a little bit of an unusual individual in that you're working for a Catholic college, and you're not a Catholic. So I wonder if you could maybe briefly trace your own kind of religious spiritual journey.
Yeah, so I wrote about this actually in the book that you mentioned, Losing Our Religion, which focuses on how non-religious parents are raising their children. I was actually raised as a Christian. My parents divorced when I was small, and my mother was raising 3 daughters by herself. She was a very spiritual person. We said grace before meals, and she would pray with us every evening before bedtime. She had us baptized and confirmed in an independent church that was called the Christian Community, and we would go there every Sunday. I also remember celebrating Christmas at my German grandmother's house. I should say here that I was in Germany at this time. And my grandmother had this whole tradition of how she would lock up the living room, and she would set up the tree and decorate it and put candles on it. And then on Christmas Day, she'd be there sitting the piano, and the candles would be lit, and we would all file in. And then we would sing, and the children would have to recite poetry, and there were readings, and it was all very dramatic and mystical and wonderful. So religion meant a lot to me when I was a child, but when I became a teenager, I started having some doubts. My mother was often depressed. Like I said, she was divorced, and she had some not so good relationships with men who didn't treat her well. And she would find solace in the idea that suffering was Christ-like, or that karmic forces would hold people accountable. And as a emerging young woman, I felt angry at that. I felt like she needed to stand up for herself, and it began really bothering me. And then I had to write a term paper in high school about Karl Marx and his ideas about religion being the opiate of the people began to ring true to me. And so one day I went to my mother and I said, "Mama, I don't want to go to church anymore." And that was the end of it. She picked her battles, and that wasn't one of them. I didn't go. So religion just stopped being part of my life until I was in my mid-20s, and I encountered feminism. And at the time, I was working at a fancy college prep school outside of Boston, and there was a young woman who I met there who was actually coaching the girls' cross-country team with me. And she was a graduate student at the time, and she got me on to reading Mary Daly and other feminist critics of how religion enforces a kind of patriarchy. And at first, that sort of put a hammer in the coffin of religion. I was sort of turned off from religion anyway, and that gave me yet another reason to reject it, especially Christianity and the whole idea of a male God and scriptural passages that talk about women needing to submit to their husbands. But as I got into it, I discovered in my conversations with her that there were other religious traditions that imagined the divine as feminine. And I was fascinated by that. And so I signed up for a course at Boston University about Hinduism. And I remember it was taught by an older man of Indian heritage. He was probably as old as I am now. And he was someone who saw connections between religious symbols and psychological meanings. He was a bit of a Jungian, and he would bring in objects and pictures, and one day he even sang and played music. And I was just absolutely hooked. And my perspective began to change. I began to see religion more in terms of metaphors and ritual performance that express the human search for meaning. And there are so many different ways of doing that. And so I became curious about what they are. I would say that at that time in my life, I became a bit of a seeker, I suppose you would call it. And I applied to graduate school in the field of religious studies. And religious studies, of course, is different from theology in that it's an interdisciplinary field that approaches the study of religion historically and from using the tools of social science and so on. And so it's this amazing window to learn about other cultures and to learn about the many different religious and spiritual traditions that exist in this world. And so I began to do that. And it was a wonderful exploratory time in my life. I think graduate school, especially in a field like religious studies, is a great way to explore different spiritual traditions, right? So I could go to a UFO cult gathering, or I could go to a Wiccan ritual, or I could study Orthodox Jewish Talmud study group without making a commitment, right? I was just there to learn. But I never really found anything that clicked with me. So once I got a PhD and I got the job here at Sacred Heart, I was very busy, and spirituality pretty much slipped back out of my life. That changed when I had a baby. I made some notes for myself here. So excuse me there. I had a baby 17 years ago. My daughter is now a teenager applying to college. But back then, I had to face the question of, what is it that I want to transmit to her? What is it that I really believe? It's a question I didn't really have to think that much about before that, when it was all just about me. But now there's this other person in my life, and I had to think about, what is it that I believe? What is important to me? What is it that I want to pass on to her? And so part of me wanted to give her what I grew up with, right? All that mystery magic of my childhood Christian tradition and my grandmother and her rituals. And then I realized that I'm not my mother, and I'm not my grandmother, and I can't do that because it would be disingenuous. It's not who I am. And that was the time that actually prompted me to write that other book that became Losing Our Religion. I became curious about how other non-religious parents handle this question. So at this stage in my life, I would say that I'm an agnostic is probably the best description, meaning that I do not believe in God, especially not the kind of personal God of many religions. I am open to the idea that there is another dimension that exists in the universe that is non-material. Perhaps it's an energy, perhaps it's spiritual. I don't know. I'm not sure there is a way that we can know for sure. I believe that we are all part of nature. Like all of the other animals, human beings are part of nature. And nature is beautiful, and it's also violent. And I think that human beings are distinctive in that our brains are more developed. We are in some ways more intelligent. I believe that we should use that ability to do good things in the world, to improve this planet that we live in and the relationships between each other and between the other living beings that exist on this planet. Unfortunately, we don't always do that. I'm also probably in the last several years, I've become interested in mindfulness practice and in yoga in ways of quieting the mind and paying attention to what's going on in my body and in my mind, and also to come to accept the way things are. I'm also very passionate about changing the way things are to the extent that I am able, about working for positive change in my community. I spent many years as an environmental activist in my local city of New Haven. I've been very involved in my neighborhood where I live, in organizing community events, in helping people who have less than I have, and that kind of thing. So I think that to the extent that religion encourages human beings to be compassionate and to help each other and to be respectful of other humans and of the planet, I am all for it.
Well, that's a good introduction to you, and of course it's like a very complicated question as to what exactly is religion.
Yes,
but
I agree.
That's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about. Now, as you know, maybe you don't know, I read the chapter in your book that you're working on, this anthology book, this New Perspectives in Spirituality, Religion, and Aging. Mm-hmm. And in there, you talked about your atheist friend of yours who came to terms with the possibility of his upcoming demise. Can you briefly describe what transpired and how that inspired you to do the research for your upcoming course of study?
Yeah, so that was about my friend Vincent, who passed away several years ago. And in that chapter, I wrote about a party that I had for Vince at my house. It was for his 72nd birthday, and there were a group of people there, a group of friends who would gather fairly regularly to have some dinner and some wine and conversation. And so we were all there, and it was Vince's birthday, and we kind of suspected that this might be his last birthday because he was in the 4th stage of cancer. And so after eating and drinking, we were all sitting on couches and chit-chatting, and Vince clinked his glass and he wanted to talk to us. And he said something like, "I'd like to talk to you about the elephant in the room. I am dying, and this is probably the last birthday that I will celebrate with you." He then proceeded to reflect on his life and his impending death. And I remember he talked about being afraid. He talked of his fear of losing control of his body, what was happening to his body. He talked about his worry that he would not be able to finish this project that he was working on. He also talked about sadness at having to say goodbye to all of us, at having to say goodbye to his partner. And he spoke about gratitude. He spoke about how grateful he was for our friendship and for the richness of his life's adventures. And then he spoke about curiosity. And Vince was very much a curious man. And he talked about how he wondered what dying might reveal in relation to his ongoing quest to define the nature of consciousness. So Vince had this project going. He was at heart a scientist, which is what caused him to reject religion, but it also caused him to be open to all kinds of different life experiences. He had been trained as an engineer, and he had quit his job at a large corporation to move to Kenya to teach math to children. And then later on, when he learned that he had cancer, he traveled to Peru to take ayahuasca with a shaman. And so in the final years of his life, he became kind of obsessed with creating this computer code that would visualize the Mandelbrot set, which is a complex mathematical formula I do not understand and will not explain to you. But it was supposed to be a model of his ideas of consciousness and energy. And so Vince was actually, as he was approaching death, thinking about what he might learn.
Wow.
So he was a committed atheist, and it was really interesting because several people in our friendship group had imagined that facing death might cause him to go back to the Catholic Church, but it didn't. He totally rejected what he saw as false comfort in the face of dying. And so to Vince, facing death was kind of this last mystery to be probed. With fear, yes, but also with his eyes wide open.
So how did this impact you, if at all?
Well, it was a very moving experience to be there with him. His story is exceptional in that, you know, if you look at the statistics in the United States anyway, most people become more religious as they age.
My mother is like that. She's 94.
Yeah. My mother is like that as well. And she's always been a very spiritual person, but I think that has intensified as she's got older. And so Vince's experience and my experience of him is really what kind of started me on this recent research project. I became curious, how do people who are not part of religion, who identify as atheist or as agnostic or simply nothing in particular, how do they approach these questions of meaning as they are in the later years of their life and approaching their own mortality?
Now, in the introductory chapter, or in the chapter that you shared with me, you also talked briefly about the Pew study.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering how your research fits into the context of what's going on in terms of people's belief systems in the United States, or for that matter, also in the United Kingdom. There's similar research has come out of there.
Yeah, there have actually been a number of large organizations, Pew, the Gallup organization regularly does surveys. There's another one out of Baylor University that sort of do large-scale, nationally representative studies to get a sense of where people's religious identification and belief and practice is heading. And so these types of researchers they try to measure religiosity, right, in terms of various factors like belief and belonging and participation. And by all of these indicators, the United States has, in the past, been actually more religious than countries like Britain or other European nations. And that is starting to change. I've got some statistics written down here that I haven't memorized, so I'm going to put this paper here. Until the 20th century, the vast majority of Americans identified with some religions. Most of them Christian, about 80% of them as Christian. But in the early 1990s, that started to change. So surveys have always asked people about religion, and then depending on how you respond, they put you in a certain category. So that term nuns that you mentioned earlier, when people identify as either atheist or agnostic or nothing in particular, they are grouped as the nuns when it comes to religion. And so what we know is that back in the 1950s, only about 2% of the US population identified as having no religion. By the 1980s, it was still only about 7%. But by 2001, right at the turn of the century there, it was 10%. By 2012, it was 16%. And the most recent numbers that we have from 2017 are nearly 30% of people saying they're not connected to any religion. So that's a really dramatic change. The other thing that's interesting there is that within this group of people who identify as having no religion, increasing numbers are identifying as saying that they are atheist or agnostic, which is a stronger way of having no religion than saying nothing in particular. I should also say that while the strongest growth in this nun group has been among young people, the so-called millennials, it has actually affected all age cohorts.
That's interesting because I wasn't aware that when you took the nuns out, I'd never seen that quantified in terms of how many people are atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious kind of thing. But you seem to be indicating that maybe I'm just misreading you, but you seem to indicate that a large number of those people are consider themselves atheists or at least agnostics.
Yeah, so they used to just measure how many people said they had no religion, but the more recent surveys have tried to break it down a little bit more, and so the numbers that we now have indicate that maybe 1/3 identify as atheist or agnostic, and the rest of them are what you call nothing in particular.
Right.
Now, if you look at the nothing in particulars, you can further break those down into spiritual but not religious, meaning those people who have some spiritual interest versus those who are really not interested in that at all. We sometimes call them indifferent or culturally religious, those kinds of people who will tell you, I could care less,
Right.
even though they might celebrate Christmas or Passover.
Now, what in general do we know about how older people react to the onset of mortality? You talked about this a little bit earlier. So that's everybody, whether they're, whatever their belief systems are.
Mm-hmm. So it's hard to generalize. It depends, of course, on your health. It depends on, do you have a support system? Are you living with your family who is caring for you? Or are you in an institution where perhaps nobody's visiting you? And then finally, what is your meaning system for making sense of what is happening to you? So there's a certain amount of variation. Now, that said, there are some patterns that we can say apply to most people, right? Recognizing our mortality is about accepting limits. I have a daughter who's 17. When we're young, the possibilities are limitless. We feel like we can live forever. She rides her bike home from a dance at midnight without a light. Right? And so as we get older, we realize that there are limits. We don't live forever. Aging brings loss. And there's two kinds of loss that really stand out. One is what you might call the loss of autonomy and control, so that as we age, we lose some level of control over our bodies. We can't walk as quickly as we used to. Maybe we have a hard time climbing the stairs. There's some loss of control over the mind. We begin to become more forgetful and so on. So there's the loss of autonomy and control. And then the second type of loss is the loss of a relationship, that people we have loved and cared about will die, or perhaps they're still here, but they have dementia and we can't talk to them the way that we used to. And so this brings us face to face with our own limits. So what I'm trying to say here is we can say as a generality that aging brings adversity, no matter whether I'm male or female or rich or poor or whatever my race or ethnicity or my religion, we're all going to face these losses. And so how do we deal with that adversity? Well, this is where meaning becomes important. So social scientists have known for decades that there's a very strong link between being resilient to adversity, being able to cope with that kind of adversity, and having a meaning system.
So how does religion fit into that?
Well, let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
I want to first talk a little bit about what a meaning system is.
All right.
Because I like to frame a meaning system as kind of a map, right? Imagine you are heading into unknown territory without a map. And there's mountains and trees and rivers and perhaps even houses and roads, but you don't know their names. They're not marked. You don't know how they're related to each other. And after a while, you might become frightened and confused and even terrified. And what a map does is it imposes order on what would otherwise be chaotic. A map names things and draws connections so that we can find our place, so that we can look back and say, oh, this is where I came from, and here are some paths towards where I can go. So religion, for many people, has functioned very effectively in providing this kind of map. Religion has these powerful stories that many of us learn in childhood that tell us where we came from and where we are going. And we can adapt those stories to our own individual situation. So if you, for example, the story of Job and the way it frames suffering as a test or a challenge from which I can learn something. And if I have cancer or some other disease, I can look at that as this opportunity for me to grow. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
And so religion has historically been a very powerful way for people to have a map. I think in addition to that, religion also offers action steps that we can engage in, such as prayer or meditation, so that when the medical intervention fails, we're not helpless. There's something we can do.
You know, this it strikes me that whether you are religious or not, it's useful to have a map as one gets older.
Yeah.
And one copes with the onset of mortality.
Mm-hmm.
And even your friend Vince, even though he was not religious, he had a map to a certain extent.
Yes.
Or he was looking to create a map, let's say.
Yes, and that's what this research that I'm currently doing is really trying to find out, which is what are the maps or what are the components of the maps that are important to people outside of religion.
Right. So you alluded to this earlier, but it seems obvious that as people get older, the tendency to be religious increases. Is that correct? Do we know this by study, or is this just me knowing about my mom and you knowing about your mom?
No, it's not just anecdotal. There's actually a huge literature on this. If you do a search and you type in religion and aging or religion and end of life, you will get hundreds. Actually, the first time I did it, I got something like 1,200 search results. So there's been many studies looking at that question. And so what we know is a couple of things. One is we know that there's cohort studies, right, that compare religiosity by various measures among different generational cohorts, like the millennials or the baby boomers or the so-called silent generation. And those studies show that the older generations as a cohort are typically more religious than younger people. So, for example, we know that about 36% of millennials will tell you that they don't have a religion and they don't practice anything. They're nuns, compared to only about 10% of the elderly. So that's one thing. But we also know, and this is from longitudinal studies where they follow people over several decades, we know that people actually become more religious or more spiritual as they get older, meaning their interest in spiritual questions and their involvement in organized religion will tend to increase.
Now, when I read your chapter, and I don't know whether it was the final chapter or not, but one of the things you did is you did some case studies with some individuals, and it occurred to me, first of all, it's very I don't know how useful it would be, but to talk about non-religious people, there's a broad category. There's lots of different subcategories inside of that.
Yes.
But it occurred to me that pretty much, well, not everybody, but most of these 5 individuals that you mentioned, they had different maps. They had different ways of looking at it. What can you say, is it possible to generalize about how non-religious people approach end-of-life decisions and end-of-life? How do they make meaning?
I don't think it's possible to generalize simply because we don't know enough.
Don't have enough data.
Yeah. Not to toot my own horn here, but this is pretty cutting edge stuff. We don't have much information, and that's probably why my project got funded, right? We need to learn more about this. There is one really interesting study that came out of Britain a few years back, and it was a small study. What they did is they compared matched pairs of elderly individuals. So they matched them in terms of demographic factors like age and gender and health and marital status and education and so forth, but they were different on religion. So they would match people who were otherwise similar, and they would have one individual who was religious and one individual who was atheist. And they compared a whole bunch of these matched pairs. And what they found was that in terms of coping with one's impending death, in terms of having some level of serenity around that, it didn't matter. And this was really interesting. It didn't matter whether the meaning system was a religious or atheist, but what mattered was how strong one's conviction was. So the people who were very devout or very committed atheists, like my friend Vince, very passionate about whatever their belief system was, were able to use that map very effectively to make sense of what was happening to them. But the individuals who were unsure and doubting and confused, whether they were religious or whether they were secular, had a harder time.
Now, I know this maybe is another way of asking the same question, but I'll risk it anyway. So when you talk about Vince, and you talk about religious people in general, to use your metaphor, they have a map.
Yes.
They have a way to be able to make meaning out of this thing that's going to happen to them, which
Hmm.
is their demise. Are there other maps that you can talk about beside the religious maps that people use to cope with this subject?
Yeah. So what I can tell you about is some themes, if you will, that are showing up. I'm hesitant to make generalizations simply because I am still in the midst of this project. I'm not done yet. I've begun to analyze some of the data, and that was the basis for that chapter that you read in that book that we published. But it's still very much ongoing. So some of the general themes that are emerging, um, I should back up here and say that in this research, we are having conversations with people, right? So this is not a survey. And the reason that I decided not to do a survey was that the survey categories that we have are based on a predominantly religious population. And so the questions are biased in that they reflect that framework. They tend to ask people what they don't believe instead of what they do believe. So what I do instead is I ask people to talk about their story. I'm engaging in what we might call narrative research. And I'm looking at what are the building blocks of that story? What are the components that create a framework of meaning for that story?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so one of those frameworks that I've run into more than once is what we might call a personal growth narrative. What I mean by that is that popular psychology has become an important building block of meaning for many people, especially non-religious people in our society. And these narratives often involve looking back and talking about perhaps a dysfunctional family, a troubled childhood, a lack of love, and how that might generate a lack of self-acceptance in the individual telling the story, or even self-hatred or unproductive patterns. And then the individual will talk about various events that happen in their lives in terms of that psychological framework. And then they will talk about having some transformative insight that generated growth and healing and change. And so that insight could be getting a divorce and seeing a therapist, right? Or admitting that one is an alcoholic and entering a 12-step movement. Those types of things. And so this framework of the personal growth narrative is a very real meaning system in which adverse events that are related to aging, like the loss of control over my body or a loved one who has died, can be framed as an opportunity for personal growth.
And that's something that can fit into any kind of framework, be it religious or non-religious.
Yes, and that is, I think that's important that you mention that, because that's another theme, which was people combine meaning systems, right? Typically we have one that is dominant, but we combine them. And so in the pilot study, I was interviewing both people who were religious and, for comparison, people who are non-religious. And what I found is that even people who are religious draw on various meaning systems, and so do people who are non-religious. So it's actually not that simple.
Right. We're not that linear.
No, we are not.
You know, one of the things that occurs to me, now, one of the things that religion seems to do very well, at least Christianity, which is mostly what I'm familiar with, is that they give you rituals in order to be able to cope with things. You know, like, for example, I don't know, the Catholic Church has its like Eucharist, or what's it called? The last, I forget what it's called, but there's something that end of life kind of rituals that one can participate in that help contextualize the whole process of dying, let's say. Is there any kind of parallel thing among non-religious people?
Yeah, so that's an important question. I think that there is some of that. There's probably not enough of it yet. So, and the reason I say there's not enough of it is that I think ritual helps people.
Hmm.
Ritual creates a framework, some structure through which we can express our emotions and our fear and our grief, which is why you'll find that even some non-religious people will find a traditional religious ritual helpful. I remember my husband, when he lost an aunt back in England, um, he was raised by his aunt for reasons I can't get into. And she died when she was in her late 80s, and he went over there for the funeral, and it was a Christian funeral. And my husband doesn't believe in God, and I've never seen him inside a church. And he came back from this trip to England, and he talked about what it meant to him to be there in that church and to be there with these other people who were remembering his aunt. And so that ritual was very helpful to him. And I think that that's something that people who are non-religious are more on their own, perhaps, right, to create it themselves. There is a movement within some non-religious organizations to provide for that. So, for example, the American Humanists and also the British Humanist Society have developed a system of what they call celebrants. And these are individuals who will create a ceremony for the family to remember that individual in a way that provides some structure to that remembrance.
Yeah, I guess one of the somewhat common things is that you mentioned you mentioned Vince. I'm familiar with somebody when we know that someone's going to die and that person is still conscious or cognizant, or whatever word you want to use. Oftentimes we'll have like a kind of a service. It doesn't have to be religious, but we'll say things like, I remember you in such and such a way, and I remember that. And I've participated in several kind of things like that, and I guess that is a ritual to a certain extent.
Oh, absolutely. And there are people who will do things like invite a bunch of people over to their 87th birthday party and ask each person to give a eulogy because they say, I want to hear this before I go.
Right.
We say all these nice things after you're gone.
Right. So, what are we to make, Dr. Manning, of this growth of this phenomenon that you let me know about, which is death cafes, which I guess started in Europe and now it's spread to the United States?
Yeah, so the death cafes, that's a really interesting phenomenon.
Probably define it a little bit for people that are not familiar with what we're talking about.
Sure. So I attended one of them, and there are actually websites where you can find out more about them. Basically what it is, it's a gathering of people to have usually coffee and something to eat to talk about death. And it's generally they will pick a certain date and they'll advertise it via a meetup or something like that. And you can go generally to a public place, usually, as I said, at a coffee shop or maybe a restaurant. And there will be a facilitator who will provide some talking points. The one that I went to was hosted by the Fairfield Humanists near where I live. And they had some opening remarks, and then they divided us into smaller groups. And we kind of went around the table and talked openly about really anything, questions related to death and dying, our beliefs, our feelings. There were some folks there who had recently lost someone. There was one person who was sick and facing their own mortality, and it kind of gave an open, safe space to talk about these things. And I think that this is very positive, because if you look at our modern society, we talk about everything.
Everything but death.
Yes, your sex life, your emotional problems, everything is on television and on these talk shows. But death is sort of this last taboo. And so I see this as really an effort to be more open about them.
So I'm going to ask you about your own attitudes toward your own mortality in a minute, but what haven't I asked you that I should be asking you that's important for us to talk about?
Well, I think maybe one thing that you didn't ask me has to do with why we're seeing this growth in the non-religious population.
Okay.
That's usually something that people ask me about. So there's a number of different reasons that are usually given for it. One has to do with the demographics, and I think that this ties into the research that I'm doing. The baby boom generation, who is now hitting their 70s, they were really the first big cohort, at least since we've been gathering this data, to leave organized religion in large numbers. Right? And this was back in the 60s, and probably had something to do with the upheaval that was going on in the culture at that time. And so more than half of them left the religion that they had been raised in, Catholic usually, or Protestant, or Jewish. And then when they would start a family in their 20s or 30s, about half of the people who left came back. But the other half didn't, right? And so those people who didn't are raising their children usually without religion, or if it is something, it's like religion light.
Right.
And so it often doesn't stick. And so you get this kind of dilution effect where each subsequent generation has a lighter dose of religion. And that is probably what is catching up with us now. That's certainly part of what has caused this big upsurge in the nuns, if you will. And that gradual change is also what accounts for the demographic difference, right, between the millennials, where non-religious is so common, and people over 70s, where it's still fairly uncommon.
So like with millennials, they might have grown up with parents that were baby boomers that abandoned religious practice. So
right.
they don't have any frame of reference in the same sense that people of my age might, for example.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole question as to why we're becoming non-religious is an interesting one. It's broad. I mean, I think the modern religion is called science. That's my view. But
yes, and actually, it's interesting that you would mention that, because this is another preliminary pattern in my project. I find that science can be very much a meaning system for people
Absolutely.
who are not religious, right? This idea that of the evolution of nature, of human beings existing in an ecosystem, of us having a role to play on this planet, right? Of our brain power maybe imposing on us some kind of moral responsibility to do something to preserve the planet. That can very much be a meaning system, and it can also apply to how we think about death and dying, in that people that I'm talking to will say that they don't believe in an afterlife in terms of sitting on a cloud and looking down on their grandchildren, but they do believe that their genetic inheritance is passed on, and so that they live on through their family in that way, and also that the things that they worked on while they were alive in perhaps being kind and helping other people will have a ripple effect, and so that they live on in that way.
Now, you're doing all this research about this subject, which some people might find very maudlin. And so, I mean, it's not fair to let you go without asking you what are your attitudes about this? You're a little bit younger than I am, so I suppose I should be more top of mind for me than it is for you. But you must have some perspective about it. So, what is it?
Yeah, so I'm healthy and in my mid-50s, so it's a little bit further away, I suppose. I have a teenage daughter, so I'm still very much focused on that. I have a good job, and so I tend not to, or I should say I have tended not to think about these things. But this year, I actually lost 2 older family members that were really important to me. And I'm working on this project where I'm interviewing people who are in their 70s and their 80s and their 90s, and one woman who was 103. And so I can't help but think about, all right, how does this apply to me? It's made me think a lot more about what do I believe about the end of life, and also how do I want to spend my time and what is important to me. I wish I could say that I believe in a soul that will survive my death. And I say I wish because I had my daughter fairly late. I was 40. So I anticipate that, you know, when she gets married someday, perhaps, and has grandchildren, hopefully I'll get to see them at least come into the world, but I may not find out what happens to them eventually. And wouldn't it be nice if I could imagine I'm sitting up there somewhere watching, but I don't believe that. I suppose given my education and what I know about how the brain works, I just can't make sense of having consciousness without a brain. And it's hard to conceive that I someday just won't be there, right? So it's a hard question to deal with. I try to focus on what's happening now. I am very much a passionate gardener. I'm one of those people who goes to the hardware store to buy a dead plant off the sales rack so that I can nurture it back. I love doing that. And I feel like all living beings, you know, flowers and bees and fish, we go back to the earth when we die. You know, we become compost. Our bodies become nourishment for other creatures. And a part of me will continue to have an impact through the lessons that I teach my daughter and so on. And so I try, I suppose I'm more conscious now that I'm getting older of how I live in the world. And I think about being kind and compassionate and wanting to leave behind a legacy of something positive, but also to take some time to smell the flowers, if you will, enjoy this world while I still can.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think about it more. My mother's 94, and I've seen her decline. I can't help but think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we should.
Yeah, it's useful too. I used to have a teacher that would say it's useful to think a little bit about death every day, and I've been doing that ever since I was in my 30s. So yeah, I don't think it's a maudlin thing.
No, it gives value to life.
So I just want to say a little bit before I thank you and that I'll say a little bit about the Diversity and Spirituality Network for our listeners here. Just those of you that are listening, if you want to get more involved in our network, the simplest way to do is to go to our Facebook page. We have a private Facebook group. We also have a regular online community gathering on Saturdays, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, the third Saturday of every month. You can find out about those and our live events on our Diversity and Spirituality Network website. And another way to get involved with us, if you really like our podcast in particular, is to support us on Patreon. And you can go to patreon.com and look for diversity and spirituality. And for as little as $1 a month, you can receive extra behind-the-scenes content about our podcast and give us suggestions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Christel Manning, for participating in our podcast and for sharing what you have to research. And I will post a link to your academic page. If people want to get in touch with you, they can do it there. And we're all looking forward to seeing what your research shows.
That would be great. And if you don't mind, I would like to invite people, since I still have until next June to do this research. If you are 70 or older and you are someone who is not affiliated with organized religion and you are spiritual but not religious or atheist or agnostic, feel free to get in touch if you'd like to participate in the research project.
Yeah, what is your email address? I mean, I'll put it in the show notes, but you might as well tell people.
My email address is manningc, that's MANNINGC, at sacredheart.edu.
Excellent. So thank you very much for participating in the podcast, and I hope people listen to it and they do contact you for that.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality?